Welcome to Business of Being Black with Tammi Mack. I am Tammi Mack. A mass shooting is defined as any incident in which 4 or more people are shot, not including the shooter. According to the Gun Violence Archive, there were 692 mass shootings in 2021. That is an average of almost 2 per day. When these mass shootings happen, lawmakers often say it is a mental health issue. Is that BS? Or a solid line of defense? The business of being Black today is, should mass shooters be privy to the mental illness defense? Please welcome civil rights attorney Lee Merritt. Hi, Lee.
Hey, how are you?
Good. Racial justice and labor rights advocate Sherry Bell. Hi, Sherry.
Hey, Tammy.
Attorney Jaye Person Lynn is here. Hi, Jaye.
Hey, Tammy. Great to be back.
And criminal defense attorney John Henry Brown. Hi, John Henry.
Yeah, hello, everybody. Happy to be here.
Yes. The first question I like to start with is why? And since this is the business of being Black, I ask, why should Black people care about the mental defense illness when it comes to mass shooters? And I'll kick this question off with you, Lee.
Well, we should care because we know that our nation is in what most experts have called a mental health crisis, that we've seen a sharp decline in the state of mental health in the United States. And a lot of that is untreated, a lot of that is undiagnosed. And if mass shootings are one of the symptoms of this mental health deterioration, we want to be aware of the threat that it exposes us to, and we want to be able to properly respond to it.
Yes, Sherry, why should Black people care?
Well, when you look at the shootings that occurred in Buffalo, New York, and Charleston, North Carolina, these shootings were premeditated, planned by lone white male shooters that were fueled by racism. They singled out these senior citizens, and churchgoers solely based on their race. And racism is not a mental illness. So when you think about how it impacts us, that targeting is a continuum of the racialized terror that we faced in this country since its inception, right? And we know that that type of narrative regarding mental illness as a defense fuels this Republican right-wing anti-gun control narrative, right? That guns don't kill people, mentally ill people with guns kill people, right? And we know that that is not the large part of the problem. The problem is accessibility to military assault grade weapons, right? So I'm sure Black people should care because many of these attacks, actually a large number of the motives in these attacks are unknown, but of the known motives, racism is one of the driving catalysts. And so for that reason, I cannot support mental health being a defense in these mass shootings.
Racism is not a mental illness. That's a good one, but you might be giving white supremacists a new idea to include racism as a mental illness. Attorney Jaye, why should Black people care about mental illness as a defense for mass shooters?
We should care about it for mass shooters because we care about it for other crimes. And if we restrict that mental health defense on this particular crime, mass shooting, it becomes a slippery slope. And now we restrict that defense for other types of crimes. So we often know people who go about their day-to-day lives, living law-abiding lives, but then they snap one day, or we know them to have some mental health conditions, and those mental health conditions lead to a manic episode that leads to otherwise criminal act. If we limit that ability to use a mental health defense on a mass shooting, and in this sense, it seems we're talking about more of the school shootings or the mass shootings that are racially promoted. But if we limit it there, then we limit it in other places. And all the times that I've been able to use that defense to the benefit of my client, where it was actually necessary for me to use that defense, I don't want to be limited. So that's why I think we have to allow for that defense, even for mass shooters.
John Henry, why should Black people care about mental illness as a defense in mass shootings?
Well, I think it's correct that, I mean, I've done over 350 trials in my career. That's just trials. So you can imagine how many other cases I've had. And basically people have mental illness or they don't. For instance, I think a lot of the school shooters, most of them, if not all of them, have had some pre-existing mental illness issues. That doesn't mean that's an excuse. The mental illness defenses are not an excuse, they're an explanation. I agree with what somebody said earlier, and I think you said, and that is that it irritates me beyond belief that certain political people and parties in this country try to blame mental health and take the focus off the real problem, which is the proliferation of firearms.
But I want to stick to the question at hand. Why should Black people care about this?
Well, I mean, in general, I've been involved in the civil rights movement since 1964. So, I mean, and the reality is that many victims in shooting cases in general, not even mass shootings, are people of color. I think, for instance, the Buffalo case, and my understanding of what had happened in the Buffalo case is absolutely no basis for a mental illness defense because the motive was racist. If the motive is racist, then mental health defense is simply not available. I think
that's interesting. So is that legal? Like, is that a legal thing when you say if the basis or if the motive is racist, you cannot use mental illness as a defense? Is that what you're suggesting?
Yes. First of all, mental illness defenses, as other lawyers here will tell you, are very difficult to succeed in general. But the definition of in order to use an insanity defense, it gets kind of complicated, but I'll put my professor's hat on for a minute. And that a person has to have a mental disease or defect. And as a result of that mental disease or defect, they don't know the difference between right and wrong and some other nuances.
Attorney Jaye, I see you nodding your head in agreement here. So we have now learned that if the motive is racism, you cannot use mental illness as a defense. Speak to what John Henry is saying.
Yes, well, to that point, and as Ms. Bell stated, racism is not defined. There's a whole DSM-4 or 5, and it's like the Bible for mental illnesses and mental health. And racism just is not in there. It's not something that the scholars in that field have designated as a mental health issue. Although obviously, I think you got to be a little crazy to truly believe in racism, but there's the racism, then there's the racial hatred. And it seems like the Buffalo shooting, the South Carolina shooting was more based on racial hatred. And if that's your purpose, then it's not someone that has this mental defect that can't tell right from wrong. It's just someone that's motivated by this hatred for this particular group. And as I want to say counsel stated, it is not easy. You have to get at least 2 different psychiatrists or psychologists to sign off on this person having this mental health issue. And typically without prior mental health diagnosis, it's very difficult to even use the mental health defense. And the other thing I point out, the mental health defense does not allow someone to go home. They then go into a locked mental facility, at least here in California, until they're deemed no longer a harm to society. And that could be just as long as a prison sentence.
The National Alliance on Mental Illness defines a mental illness as a condition that affects a person's thinking, feeling, behavior, or mood. 1 in 5 U.S. adults experience mental illness each year. Is there sometimes a rush to judgment to deem a mass shooter as deranged or mentally ill, Attorney Lee? I know as soon as a mass shooter goes out, the media immediately gathers all of their language and inevitably mental illness comes up. I'd like to say, with the exception of Black people.
Ah,
Attorney Lee?
Lee Merrick.
I'm sorry. Yeah, there
Do
is
you
a
think
tendency.
there's a rush to judgment when saying that a mass shooter has been mentally ill, is mentally ill?
When the mass shooter fits a certain stereotype, typically a white male, a younger white male, we often hear that mental health was a possible explanation for the resort to violence, or a psychotic break that led to the mass shooting. Now, we don't see that happen. We don't see that defense being successful in court very often, but certainly in the court of public opinion, we see white male shooters tend to be treated by the media with a bit more kid gloves, and a medical or mental explanation is often offered for their terrible acts.
but what's problematic, this is John Henry, what's problematic about all of these things is the mass shootings in and of themselves seem crazy. I mean, the first time you heard about Buffalo, or you heard about Sandy Hook or anything, the first reaction one has, probably not about Buffalo, but in other shootings, is that person has to be crazy. I mean, I represented a soldier in Afghanistan who went crazy and killed 16 people.
Hold that thought, attorney. We're going to take a quick break and come right back. I want you to definitely talk about that instance on the Business of Being Black with Tammi Mack on Fox Soul. We'll be back. Welcome back to Business of Being Black with Tammi Mack. I'm Tammi Mack, and the Business of Being Black today is the mental illness defense when it comes to mass shooters. John Henry, you were talking to us about a case that you've dealt with.
Well, yeah, I mean, the point I was trying to make is that the facts of the matter of mass shootings often scream, we all as citizens think, well, that person has to be crazy. Well, first of all, there's a difference between being mentally ill and using that defense legally and getting away with it, all right? But yeah, I represented a soldier in Afghanistan who went completely crazy one night and ended up killing 16 people. And there's no question that he was mentally ill. And so
when you say there's no question, what does that mean?
That
because by your suggestion, when we just regular average people see a mass shooting happen, we think inevitably that person is crazy. So when you say he was obviously had gone crazy, what were the obvious signs? What does that mean?
Well, I mean, it's a long story. But in any event, I mean, he was given drugs and alcohol by the military. He had been on his 4th deployment. He had his best friend's leg blown off the day before, had to put it in a plastic bag. I mean, he just went off the deep end. There's no question.
Got it.
So, I mean, but I think there is a danger in classifying all mass shootings as someone who's mentally ill, because I just don't think that's true. What irritates me is what you said earlier, and that is the certain members of the Republican Party, mostly, just talking about mental illness. They just try to do anything to take the focus off the gun. Now, let's talk about guns as a tool, because a gun is in some ways a tool. If we had a tool that was manufactured in the United States of America and resulted in 692 deaths, not even in a year, if we had a tool that was manufactured, the government would take some action against that tool maker, right? But our government is afraid to take action against the tool maker when we're talking about guns. And so people in positions of power try to take the focus off the firearm issue and put it on the mental health issue. And that really bothers me. And I think that should bother anybody. I don't care what your color is, basically. It's really a great concern.
At Mother Emanuel AME Church in Charleston, South Carolina, Dylan Roof murdered 8 parishioners and the pastor in 2015. At this trial, he said, "I felt like I had to do it, and I still feel like I had to do it." He had previously given the reason that Black people were raping our women and taking over our country. Does that sound like mental illness, hate, or both, Sherry?
I think it is mostly racial hatred, fueled by a lot of the narratives that we heard, what our previous president and all those people who stormed the Capitol on January 6th, these dangerous historical narratives about demonizing Black folks has contributed not only to what caused the insurrection, but also to some of these shootings that we see. As I mentioned earlier, some of the motives are unknown. Like, who knows how many more shootings are racially motivated? I know that the one there was a shooting, an act of terror, I should say, that occurred in El Paso, Texas, in Walmart, and largely Latino consumer base. And that person was influenced by this whole replacement theory, fear of losing the power that you have at the hands of already oppressed and marginalized people. So that is no different from lynchings, right? When people used to gather their families around and watch a Black person get hung from a tree and whipped and put it on postcards. That's the same type of mentality. That was a large portion of our population. To say that all those people were crazy is a bit over the top.
Yeah, I don't think they are. There are some mass shootings that clearly are mental health based, but not all of them by any means. I think actually it's an intelligence problem. It's an IQ problem more than it's a mental health problem. I'm sorry. I just think that people who are racists are not very smart. Let's just put it that way. And so that doesn't mean it's a mental health issue at all. It may be an educational issue, but it's not a mental health issue.
Right. Lawyers from each side will often bring experts in the same field to court from their case. These experts may assert opposite opinions about the same person. There could be a psychiatrist on each side of the case, one who says a defendant is mentally ill, while the other says the defendant does not have a mental illness at all. So how do we know which expert is correct and which is making assumptions? Or who do we believe? Or is that up to the jury? Is that up to the judge when handling these mental ill cases, Attorney Jaye?
Yes, it's up to the finder of fact, which is sometimes the judge, sometimes the jury. But that's where the lawyers' arguments, that's where the lawyers come in. You have two people with equitable criteria, equitable education, equitable experience, saying two different things. Then it really comes down to who argues it in a way that the jury understands the best, or the judge understands the best. So that's where the lawyers come back in. But it's really difficult to say who's right or who's wrong in something like mental health. If it was a broken arm, we could do an x-ray and we could see the broken arm. You can't x-ray someone's brain and see the mental illness in most instances. That would lead to, when it's actually a mental illness that leads to a mass shooting, there's no x-ray or MRI that you could do to prove that this person has this issue. And so it really just comes down to how the lawyers relay the information from the expert witnesses to the jury or the judge and what they believe.
I think it's a good time to point out, it's a really good time to point out there's a big difference between a diagnostically mentally illness and legal, the defense of mentally ill. A person could be completely psychotic and not fit the criteria for the defense of insanity. So that there's very little correlation between the clinical diagnosis of insanity and the legal criteria.
That is very interesting. Attorney Merritt?
When getting into the battle of experts, I think one case stands out in mind. I don't have the exact case call number, but it was involving the murder of a prominent gay politician or LGBTQAI plus.
In San Francisco,
Harvey Mudd.
Harvey Mudd.
Yeah, who went by Milk Harvey.
Right.
And in that case, the defense for his assassin, who was accused in that case, argued that because his assassin stayed up eating Twinkies all night, that he couldn't form the mens rea, the mental capacity to be guilty of the crime of murder. And they brought experts forward to testify to that. And that case really drove how, in the legal field, we began to qualify experts, because I believe in that case initially, those experts were qualified and allowed to speak before the jury. and the jury accepted that defense. If I recall right, Attorney Brown may be able to correct me on that.
Yeah, no, but I think there was a lot of homophobia behind that.
Oh, absolutely.
I mean, matter of fact, the wonderful movie won the Academy Award. But the shooter was homophobic, to say the least. He is also crazy. I don't think Twinkies made him crazy. I think he was just crazy. But I think that.
So did he serve time?
He, a brief amount of time, because there were two shootings. There was Harvey Milk, and then there was the mayor. And so he served some time for one of them, but I don't remember what. But it was outrageous. I mean, it's one of the reasons why the public has problems with mental health defense, because they keep talking about that case, the Twinkie defense, which is absurd. And it's sad.
Right. I want Attorney Merritt to continue your point on that.
Yeah. Well, I think it's always going to be difficult culturally to try to gloss over the mental health impact on these incidents. Even if we take it out of the exact trial framework and just think about it from a societal preventative measure, we need to take mental health seriously and pay attention to why in the United States, unlike any other industrialized nation, and even other nations like Venezuela or Mexico or Colombia who has comparable access to weapons, we still stand out as number one for mass shootings. And part of that is actually very much a cultural mental health problem that we're dealing with that's unique to the United States. No, it shouldn't hold up as a defense in court, but certainly in the culture, we need to address it and begin to deal with better access to mental health resources, early diagnosis, and obviously restriction of gun access to people with predictable degenerative diseases or mental health diseases.
Yeah.
The thing I wanted to point out real quick is that Black people oftentimes don't get the benefit of mental health in mass shootings, because a lot of the mass shootings that are committed by Black people are within the gang violence realm. And gang violence shootings, you might shoot 3-4 people, they're still not typically not counted in the mass shootings. So that number you quoted for 2021, Tammi, I'm not sure that quotes all the times more than 3 or 4 people got shot in a single shooting, because they typically do not count gang violence as mass shootings in that number.
Wow, that is an interesting point there. So you're saying if a gang member shoots 10 members of another gang, that is not a mass shooting?
No, it's not. It has to be like something that's not criminally involved. They may have included it recently to up the number, but when you think of Sandy Hook, Columbine, and those whole string of shootings, Buffalo, South Carolina, when there's a shooting in South Central Los Angeles where 4 or 5 people get hit, it's not going to make that list typically.
It's actually more apparent even in Chicago, where I lived and went to graduate school there for a while. But there are, I think every week in Chicago, there's shootings that involve more than 4 or 5 deaths.
Let's hold that thought, and we'll be right back on Business of Being Black. Sherry, I see you. We're coming straight to you after the break on Business of Being Black with Tammi Mack on Fox Soul. Welcome back to the Business of Being Black with Tammi Mack. I'm Tammi Mack, and today the Business of Being Black is, should mass shooters be privy to the mental illness defense? Please welcome civil rights attorney Lee Merritt, racial justice and labor rights advocate Sherry Bell, attorney Jaye Person Lynn, and criminal defense attorney John Henry Brown. Sherry, I know you wanted to get in on our last conversation, so let me get you in on your thoughts.
Yeah, so now you get into the money question, the money problem, right? When you thinking about gang shootings, you look at the socioeconomic conditions that these gang members are living in. No economic opportunity, no access and retention to good jobs, creates a whole plethora of problems. And when we talk about resourcing and funding mental illness measures at the federal, state, and local level, is just not happening at the scale that it needs to happen at. And also education and protocols to follow when we issue spot problems, right? Like when you think about the shootings that occurred in Uvalde and also in Buffalo, these terrorists actually planned and plotted their shootings online months in advance, right? So not only do we need investment in economic opportunity and to resource mental illness at every level, but we also need to just have education on what to do when you see someone makes a threat, right? As a parent, as a mental health worker, and also even as the FCC, right? Paying more attention to these knowingly online racist platforms where people go and say all kind of crazy stuff, right? So, to just look at the problem and just look at, that's not enough. You have to look at the underlying conditions. And most of all, it more often than not, it's always related to money, upholding the current power structure that's in place. And everything that happens around that is for those two things. So just,
I've got a lot of thoughts in my head right now. One of them is, is there anyone in America that's even qualified and capable of dealing with mental illness? Because look, we have been through quite an ordeal in the last 5 to 6 years here in America. And needless to say, the last 3 have really haunted us. I'm not sure that there's anyone capable of interceding before things begin to happen and get out of control mentally, because we're all on this mental roller coaster in this moment. But I do want to revert back to the gang members, Attorney Merritt. When we talk about mental illness, why can't we say that gang members have a mental illness? I mean, usually you're a part of a gang because of your living conditions, your environment, and how systemically that impacts Black people and brown people specifically in the way that, much like Sherry said, has to do with resources and finance.
Well, that's so true. And this is John Henry Brown again. I just briefly wanted to say something.
I want to give, hold on, John Henry. I want to give Attorney Merritt a chance to answer that question real quick, because he weighed in on it.
Yeah. So the institutional racism that we identify so often is built right there into the system. You have a population of a highly vulnerable aspect of our population, Black men who are often born in war zone-like areas. We're talking about the largest prison population or largest prison industrial complex in human history that are directed towards inner city communities where people are often food deprived, resource deprived, who when you think about the upbringing, you can, it's sometimes better to other it so we can look at it from another perspective. But we think about the child soldiers in different parts of West Africa who are sort of recruited into this culture of violence and trauma from a very early age, and they're just raised into it. And I'm speaking specifically, my father is one of them, who is a member of a gang, who has a bipolar diagnosis. But none of that has ever been allowed to be brought into court as a mitigating factor for any crime that he's been accused of.
Well, why do you think that is, Attorney Brown?
Well, because the system is racist. That's why. But the point is I do a lot of work for free. And in the last 4 years, I represented 4 young Black men. I'm talking young. One was 14 years old. All of them charged with murders that were just silly, shooting another person for marijuana, things like that. But what I said to the judge, and ended up helping these guys, I did in a number of ways, is that a lot of young Black and brown folks don't plan for their future. They plan for their funerals. They really don't think they're going to live beyond 20 or 21 or 22. And that there's really that attitude. Now, is that a mental illness? No. Is it a social issue that we need to deal with? Yes. Taken hundreds of years to get here, and we need to address it like now. There's a whole missing generation. All these young men had missing male figures in their lives, literally, because of mass incarceration, because of drugs, because of all that stuff.
Right.
So they had no model.
And also the deunionization of quality jobs that these men that was the head of these households used to have depleted in the United States. So that's also a contributing factor to
explain that, Sherry. Explain that.
Well, in the 1970s, you started to see the decline of good paying unionized jobs, like in the defense industry and et cetera. Especially I could speak for in California, like many of our families migrated from the South to Los Angeles, places like Los Angeles for those good quality jobs. And then when you start to see the 1980s, Reaganomics, you start to see those jobs taken away, outsourced. Then you start to see the decline of the Black family. I mean, you know, and we all know that, well, gangs actually started out of protection, right? For Black neighborhoods to be able to protect themselves from racial terror, right? So when you think about the problems that we're facing now, a lot of it is largely due to the foundation that this country was built on, which was racial exploitation of labor, of resources, of the construct of race. Somebody has to lose in order for someone to have to win, right? But we are starting to see accountability in this area that we're talking about now. Just in California, Governor Newsom introduced legislation that now victims of gun violence can actually sue the gun manufacturer. And in the mass shooting that occurred in Michigan earlier, of that shooter actually got charged with manslaughter for two reasons. One, because they made their gun available and accessible to him in their home. And two, they ignored the signs that this young man was under mental distress. So we are starting to see some changes, not because of, magic, right? There was a lot of groundwork done on the ground by activists in this area.
Well,
so I want to ask you, Attorney.
There's still a federal law that protects gun manufacturers, despite what Governor Newsom has done, which is great.
Yes.
There's still a federal law. It's the only industry in the United States where there's a federal law that gives gun manufacturers immunity from prosecution.
Why is that?
Well, I think we also have to look at it is a federally constitutional right to keep and bear arms. And I know it's been said that an issue is a gun issue, but me personally, for me and my people, I want us to have guns. And when I look back in the Black community, when all this violence and crime was not as rampant, there were guns in every house. And I think that deterred a lot of people from taking the reckless acts that they take. But I think the fact that guns is a constitutional right, I think is what led to that legislation.
Let's talk more about it when we come back. We're going to take a quick break on the Business of Being Black with Tammi Mack on Fox Soul. Welcome back to Business of Being Black with Tammi Mack. I'm Tammi Mack, and today the business of being Black is mental illness as a defense for mass shooters. Should it be allowed? We were talking about immunity for the gun manufacturers. We talk a lot on this show about police immunity too. It's interesting to me that the things that harm us the most in the Black community are immune. But we Black people seem to not be immune to the damage that these things cause. Why is it? Why is it, Attorney Brown, that the gun manufacturers receive immunity from people who are shot with guns?
Well, I think the real answer is the power of the NRA, which is waning. Thank goodness. I think Governor Newsom's contempt is great.
Is it waning? Is the power waning?
I think it's waning. Yeah, the NRA has gotten into some trouble of their own. But, keep in mind, when you talk about the Second Amendment, which was mentioned earlier, that, when the Constitution was written, the gun a person had was a muzzle loader, which would take one ball and then it takes 20 minutes to load it again. There was no AR-15. So I agree with what counsel said earlier, that guns are important for self-defense. But I think there's no rational reason to have a military grade weapon in the hands of somebody who's shooting deer. But that is powerful, but it's waning. There are some cases pending right now in Connecticut, I believe, and another against gun manufacturers. So I think, and there's a bill in Congress to undo that immunity. People who killed in car accidents, do the car manufacturers who manufacture faulty cars get immunity? No.
Okay, good point.
So, it's something that needs to be addressed.
But also someone that takes a car and rams it into a group of people, the car manufacturer would not be liable for that as well. And that's what I believe is more likened in these comparisons. Whereas it's not the malfunction of the gun that's leading to these deaths. It's the fact that the gun worked properly that's leading to these deaths. And then quickly to the point, I agree with Mr. Brown, but to a certain degree, but I also understand that these police agencies are civilian police agencies. And it's my belief that if law enforcement has that level of weaponry, then the citizenry should also be able to have the same level of weaponry as law enforcement. There's a case out of Los Angeles County, a young man, Ryan Twyman, I believe his name is. He was killed by sheriffs. They shot at him as his car was backing out, and then one ran to the trunk, got the AR, and shot the AR through the car several times. And so it just goes to show law enforcement has the ARs as well. So if law enforcement has it, and I'm a Black person in America that's never been felt protected by law enforcement, I need to be able to have the weaponry to protect myself from the tyrannical government that the Second Amendment allows, with the understanding that we are not real Americans, we're 14th Amendment Americans, meaning that when the Second Amendment was initially passed, we didn't have that right to protect ourselves anyway. So I have that understanding, but since the 14th Amendment said I have the rights of a citizen, I need to be able to protect myself against the criminal element from the private citizenry and the criminal element and the terroristic element from the government that our people have faced since we were brought to these shores.
On May 14th of this year, a white 19-year-old male killed 10 Black people and injured 3 others at a Tops supermarket in a predominantly Black neighborhood in Buffalo, New York. The shooter had a manifesto in which he laid out specific plans to attack Black people. Can a mentally ill person commit specific premeditated acts of violence like that? Can I be mentally ill but still have the mental capacity to plan an entire, he had maps and ways he was going to do this. Can I be mentally ill and still have the mental capacity to make these huge plans of killing people? Let's go to you. Go ahead, Attorney Merritt.
Theoretically, yes. Practically, absolutely not. No jury would ever buy that for a minute. I mean, mental health defenses, even when they're well-founded, are very difficult to persuade a jury. But no, not that level of planning, because one of the things is we talk about is diminished capacity. Do you have the capacity to form criminal intent? And one of the things that the doctors and look at, and eventually a jury looks at, is there planning? Did you write this out? Which means that you have the capacity to be responsible for your own acts.
Attorney Merritt.
It's important in that scenario as well. This young man was able to get the weapon with the so-called mental health condition, right?
On his 18th birthday.
Yeah, and so it's critically important, again, as we start talking about solutions, as we start talking about reducing the amount of these shootings, one of the solutions has to be reducing the availability and access to these weapons by people in mental health crisis. And when we start talking about the Second Amendment, going back to that conversation, the Second Amendment, as council person pointed out, although initially intended only for a certain segment of the society, because of the 14th Amendment, we all have access to it. But that 14th Amendment talks about, in order to maintain a well-ordered militia, the right to bear arms shall not be abridged. When we start as an African-American community, start talking about keeping our community safe from random acts of violence that we've seen increase in recent years or during times of racial turmoil, we certainly should be investing in the idea of a well-ordered militia, of a defense unit that we govern from a homegrown defense unit. But I don't think that means every person with a potential mental health disease or individually a right to an AR-15. I think that's absurd.
Sherry, I want to ask you, if you commit a crime like a mass shooting, should it matter if you are mentally ill? Should that even matter? Should you still face the same consequences?
I mean, I have to say yes, because number one, you shouldn't be on the street. Premeditation is like a very well thought out thing where you're singling out a group of people who are more vulnerable than you are. You know, mental illness is a real condition like depression or schizophrenia, but many of the times when you see mass shootings, right, like you have to choose, right? Like it doesn't have to be that way because you have a mental illness. You don't have to resort to this amount of violence perpetrated against others.
Do you think mental illness is used more for white people than Black?
Of course, yes, because a lot of what we see in the media and the narratives, like you see bias, right, and how people are viewed, like sympathy, right, for certain individuals when they commit crimes as opposed to others. And when you look at like the narratives that are being spewed by to advance certain political agendas, you definitely see a dichotomy in how one race, like a Black or even a brown person, is talked about in the media.
I want to hold that thought because I want to ask the attorneys when we come back how many mental illness cases that they see when it comes to Black people and white people. We'll be right back on Business of Being Black with Tammi Mack on Fox Soul. Welcome back to Business of Being Black with Tammi Mack. I'm Tammi Mack, and the Business of Being Black today is the mental illness defense. Now, this is what I'd like to talk about. Attorney Brown, I'm going to you on this one. Why is there such a disparity, or is there? I mean, you've done several cases. Is there a disparity between the mental illness defense when it comes to white people versus Black people? And if so, why?
Well, historically, there's been a huge difference. And it's basically as everything boils down to money. Back when I was a public defender, 35 years ago, 40 years ago, we had no resources to hire the best doctors in the world. And white folks did. Now that's changing. I think it's also changing in California, but I know in Washington State now, public resources are being made available to indigent defendants, and with the amount of resources being high enough to hire the best experts.
So are you simply saying it's about money? Perhaps Black people don't have as much money as white people to do the mental illness defense?
Yeah, I mean, there's psychiatric defense cases. The doctors have cost over $100,000 or more. There's one going on right now. Your viewers might want to watch the Parkland one that's being done right now, where there's the sentencing phase. It's very interesting. I know one of the doctors involved in that case. And he's an excellent doctor, probably one of the best in the whole United States. But his fees are being paid by the state. So that's a change. That's a change. That's just happened in the last 5 to 10 years. I believe council in California would agree with that, I think.
Attorney Person Lynn, is mental illness an affluent defense for the affluent?
It can be. There was a famous case out of Texas where the young man was given leniency. I believe he committed like a vehicular homicide, but he was given leniency by the judge as his attorney brought in the experts to testify that he suffered from affluenza, which means he was too affluent to understand the consequences of his actions. And it's a term you can actually Google and look up, and there's actual diagnosis that one can receive. But obviously you have to be affluent to raise that defense. And then to another point on the differences between Black and white are the mental health professionals. Most of them by far are not Black. There's very few Black mental health professionals. And so if you don't understand the history of Black people, you don't know the traumas that we've suffered, you will not put that into your analysis. And then you'll just say he's doing this out of a criminal mind, not of any trauma that they won't recognize. And one point, if I have a client that I'm claiming post-traumatic stress syndrome or post-traumatic stress disorder led to his actions or her actions, if that person was a U.S. military vet, the prosecutors and the courts are more willing to accept that. But if that person is just a South Central vet, although they may have seen as much death as the U.S. military vet, as much trauma as a U.S. military vet, it's not respected the same way, even though it's the same kind of violence and trauma that led to the PTSD in the first place.
Wow, that's a great point. Just want to know. So, did he get off on the affluent plea?
He got like probation, I believe, and then like went down to Mexico and did something else, and then I think he had to serve a little bit of time for that. But yes, he was given probation with the affluenza defense.
Attorney Merritt, how are these cases? How do they compare? White people pleading mentally ill versus Black people pleading mentally ill.
The mental health defense or the mental insanity defense is already a very high threshold at law. And we find white defendants are more capable of availing themselves of this defense because of better access to resources. And so we see the defense benefiting disproportionately white defendants, but we don't see this defense as terribly strong at law. I think it's important, though, that as we, again, as our society begins to deal with the reality of the impact of a historic pandemic, for example, on the mental health of our nation, and the reality of the lack of access to basic health care, let alone mental health care for marginalized communities, we need to begin to respond. I'll tell you this as a civil rights attorney, I'm getting more phone calls about law enforcement officers who are being called to respond to family members in mental health crisis, people in their homes, in their pajamas, not really a threat to the community, being shot dead during the mental health crisis. We need to develop mental health resources in this nation. I think it's part of Biden's Build Back Better program, but we need to specifically begin to develop mental health departments, begin to pour serious, intentional resources into addressing the mental health crisis in our country.
As a civil rights attorney and community organizer, tell us about that.
Well, the first thing that I have to do when dealing with families, before we can identify the appropriate prosecutor or who to get the facts before in order to get to justice, I tell families it's critically important that you begin to insulate yourself from the ongoing trauma that you're experiencing.
Oh, wow.
When dealing with families like the family of Tatiana Jefferson, who was playing video games in her home with her 7-year-old nephew, when a police officer walked up to her bedroom window and shot her through her bedroom window, the ripple effects of that traumatic event on her family that eventually killed both her mom and her dad and has her sister in the hospital right now is honestly like a psychological explosion in the community. Not only do we all feel the threat.
I don't think people understand how that is traumatic to a whole community. Sherry, tell us about the LA Black Worker Center.
Well, the LA Black Worker Center is here to serve our community, to ensure that Black workers have access and retention to quality jobs so our communities and our families can thrive. I'm currently on the board and a member of the Political Education Committee. We've worked on several, local legislation, such as the workforce demonstration project with the city of LA to a pilot program to get Black workers into city jobs, because we know that having a strong economic base has a lot of positive
thank you for doing that work. I certainly appreciate it. John, The Devil's Defender, Attorney Brown, The Devil's Defender, talk about it.
Well, it's a book. I wrote, I never thought it would be a book. Started as a journal, and then I met some people in your business back in New York and other places and in LA. And now they're trying to turn it into a miniseries, which is hilarious. It's a book I wrote about my career. It's interesting because really only about 40 or 50% about it is law, because before law, I was in music, rock and roll business. And then before I went to law school, I was working in Washington, D.C. in the media. So it sounds
like it's going to be, it is an amazing book, full of adventure. That's what it sounds like.
Well, thank you. Yeah. It's gotten a lot more attention than I ever thought it would.
Well,
I'm very honored. I'm very
We're happy about that. Attorney person Lynn, please tell us how we can follow your work.
Definitely. Instagram, Lincoln Lawyer LA. Great show on Netflix as well. just finding me here. I like to be out in the community. I do a lot of work with 100 Black men in efforts to expose young men in particular to various professions and ways that they can earn a living.
We love that organization, 100 Black Men. And Attorney Merritt, tell us how we can keep up with your work.
You can follow me at Lee Merritt ESQ on most social media platforms, or LeeMerrittESQ.com. Next week, we begin the sentencing phase in the Ahmaud Arbery trial for the 3 men at the federal level for the hate crime charges in the Ahmaud Arbery trial. So please tune in for that as well.
We'll definitely be looking forward to that. Thank you so much, Attorney Merritt, Attorney Person Lynn, and Attorney Brown, and also Sherry. Thank you for being on the show today. That is the business of being Black with Tammi Mack. Until next time, everybody.